Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, it's like that old joke where you say if you're out walking around with your buddy and you come across a gator or any predator, could be a tiger, and it's intent on eating one of you. You don't have to outrun the alligator or the predator, right? You just have to outrun your friend. It's kind of the same thing in this real dog eat dog world that we live in. So one of the reasons, of course, that they school is just as Daniela said, it's safety. There's a bunch of them out there, and a predator. And these guys on the right don't look as if they're predacious, but if a predator was wanting to be successful, his best chance at being successful would be to focus on one of those fish, just one. Just look at one. There's a bunch of them around there, because as soon as he makes his attack run in, they're going to change directions. And many times what they'll do, like when birds do that thing, they might splitter or change directions. Splitter? I just did my mother. They might splinter and change in many different directions. And what that does is it gets the predator to go oop and look at a different fish. And then when they change direction really rapidly again, he goes oop and he looks at this fish. And then he starts focusing. Wait, no, this one's closer. Wait, this one's closer. Wait, that one's hurt. And before you know it, he's got nobody. Most predatory runs in animals, I don't know if this is, I'm sure it varies quite a bit across, but like, for example, I think it was among cheetahs, they're 80% failure when they chase it. Fish, I bet you it's a little bit more successful, but it's not 100%, that's for sure. One of the other things that schooling does, it makes it convenient when you need to find a mate, right? Especially if you live in areas where, it might be a little bit more difficult to see or sense where that mate might be. So all right, so chapter 14 is looking at critters in the upper part of the ocean. That's what we mean by the pelagic, remember? The benthic is going to be the lower part, and then the pelagic region is going to be that region at the upper part of the ocean. And as we move through, we can extend what we're calling the pelagic region to not just that eutrophic or that euphotic region at the top that photosynthesizes, but technically the pelagic region is going to be that deep water out in the middle of the ocean. Okay, so pelagic becomes a little bit different defined depending on whether you're over the continental shelf, right, or if you're over the deep ocean. Pelagic in the continental shelf is a shallower condition, but out in the deep ocean, it follows it all the way down. So we'll go look at all those organisms. So when people talk about pelagic critters, it sometimes means right in the middle of the ocean kind of critters or deep water critters. And even though the continental shelf is close to shore, it still by folks would be considered sometimes pelagic. Many times when you get out of sight of land, people think they're out in the middle of nowhere. I know in the Navy we used to always say that out in the middle of the sea, it was the closest land was 3 miles straight down. Because it's funny, I never realized this when we were traveling across the Pacific Ocean. There aren't charts for the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We had maps as we were around, shoreline or islands, and so we could navigate and track ourselves. But when we got out in the middle of the ocean, and there was no land around for thousands of miles. We just used basically these blank pieces of paper that we wrote the latitude and longitude on, just to make sure we stayed on track. But I was like, oh, that makes sense. Who needs a big map of blue? One of the things when you're out there in the pelagic region is if you're a floater, if you're planktonic, right? That's what we mean by being a floater. Like, for example, there are microscopic plankton and there are plankton a little bit bigger. There are macroscopic plankton. And some of the microscopic plankton use things like fats or oils, which are less dense than water. But look at this guy right here. Look at this is a radiolarian. Isn't that beautiful? Come on, not white. There we go. Isn't that beautiful? That's amazing. That's a very thin silica test or shell that's in the middle there. Basically glass. So it's like this extremely thin glass with all these little tiny holes, all these little tiny pinholes that these projections, that's what these things are, these projections stick out through. Now what they do with those projections is they catch food. Okay, those are actually there's a name for them. They're called pseudopods. Oh, I bet you, Danielle, you remember pseudopods from Bio 1, right? Remember amoebas had pseudopods. But these are thin pseudopods. The amoebas have blunt pseudopods. So they use these to capture food. But as far as the floating thing does, it's a math thing again. When you increase the organism's surface area In other words, when you increase the amount of organism that there is in the water space, like with these little projections, it makes it more difficult to sink, increases drag so that things can float. Foraminifers are protozoans. Well, regularians are protozoans too. They're single-celled microscopic critters. But man, I tell you, their tests are made of calcium carbonate. But these are some forams. Forams for short. A lot of times forams look like little miniature snail shells. They're not snails though. They're actually little protozoan critters. Isn't that neat? Very thin, very delicate calcium carbonate chalk, right? So think about that as chalk. And oftentimes, again, what it'll be, it'll have these projections that are sticking through the holes that increase surface area and help them capture food, depending on the species. Now, copepods aren't microscopic. Why did I put them? Well, yes, some are. Some copepods are microscopic. But they're not protozoans. They are actually animals. They're crustaceans, lobsters, shrimp, those kind of critters. Organisms that belong in a big group of other critters that all have this, or many of them have this unique characteristic of segmentation. See how that's segmented? These organisms down here, they're in segments. That's a characteristic of members of that group. In terms of the plankton floaters, there's 75,000 species, over 75,000, and a majority of the stuff out floating around the ocean in the pelagic region is going to be these copepods, at least a majority of the zooplankton. The zooplankton, the ones that feed on the phytoplankton. Look at these things, aren't they neat? It's like those big, it's not for ornamentation as much as it's just for functionality to help them float. So cool. Bigger plankton like krill. Krill are basically miniature shrimp. There are many different species of them, though, about 1,500 or a little over that. Very, very abundant around the South Pole. This is the food of choice of a lot of the filter feeding whales, like the blue whales that go down. They use their baleen to kind of scoop up, you know, all of this huge, massive krill. Down around Antarctica is plenty to eat. 800 billion pounds is the biomass of krill. That's what you see floating. This is huge floating mats of it. Krill is what we call a keystone species, and that's an important term. So I want to take a minute to explain what we mean by a keystone species. The word keystone species comes from this whole thing in engineering when you're building an ark. When the Romans and the Moors and folks years ago built arks, they didn't use cement or anything like that. What they did is they stacked these rocks like this with, you know, each of them being cut kind of a little bit of an angle so you can make a curve. And when they got to the top, so they built here and they built here, so they built from both sides. And when they got to the top, what they did is they put this stone in the middle. If you've walked ever underneath an ark, you often may have noticed that there's one stone that's a little bit different shape than the other. It's usually kind of like that, right? That's called the keystone. And the purpose of the keystone is what keeps the ark up. If you were to pull that keystone, there's no glue holding any of this, even though these are separate, right? But if you pulled that keystone up, those blocks would fall and the arch would collapse. Now, what that means in ecology, though, is a keystone species is oftentimes that species, or sometimes there's more than one, that would have the largest effect on an ecosystem if you removed it. Like, for example, years ago, there was this thought of getting rid of a lot of the sharks that were off the coast of North Carolina. Now, they went out and started fishing up a bunch of the sharks. The sharks were predators on the stingrays. Since the stingrays weren't being preyed upon, their populations boomed. It rose. And stingrays feed on scallops. And the other thing that feeds on scallops are scallop fishermen. Well, they may not feed upon them, but they certainly go collect them. So when the ray population boomed, because there were no sharks to feed them, then the scallop population crashed. And there were no scallops for the rays, and there were no scallops for the scallop fishermen. So right there is like an economic input. See, in that case, the shark would have been the keystone species. Sometimes it's something that's really insignificant, not insignificant. That's why it's always really, oh man, that's always right. It's so frustrating and dangerous when we start messing with ecosystems. Because you go in there and start monkeying with stuff, you never know if if you hit the wrong button kind of thing and cause the collapse of an ecosystem. Krill, the reason why they're the keystone species down in Antarctica is because they provide so much food for everything else. It's basically like they are the food place in town. If you removed them, they'd be gone. Cnidarians are things like jellyfish or hydra. Cnidarians, the C is silent, by the way. They're all united by having one characteristic. They have these things called stinging cells. Even the little microscopic hydra that you see in the picture that have stinging cells. They use these stinging cells to defend themselves, as you may have experienced if you've ever been down the Keys or at the beach. But they also use them for food capture. Those little stinging cells have a barb that comes out. That's what happens when you trip this little cell. It shoots this barb inside of you, and the barb has actually got these little hooks on it. So there's this barb, microscopic basically, with these little hooks that stick into your skin. And along with the barb, you get a little dose of venom, and that's what causes the stinging. Yeah, the venom can actually be alleviated by using something acidic, like vinegar. If you pour vinegar on it, urine, right? Like was in the Friends episode, you actually that will work because it's slightly acidic. But so the moon jellyfish, the hydra, these are all members of this Cnidarian group. There are lots of groups, well, not lots. There are a handful of groups of Cnidarians, but two of the ones that are probably known best is the hydrozoans, which include the hydra that I mentioned before. There it is. Hydras are one of the unique ones, though, because they are freshwater. Most Cnidarians are saltwater. Most Cnidarians are marine. And then the jellyfish is the other one. Oh, I'm sorry, the Portuguese man of war, too, like this one. Portuguese man of war is, oh, man, that's a weird critter. The Portuguese man of war is actually a collection of organisms living together. There's a group of cells that make up this float that floats on the surface that kind of goes around with the wind. There's a group of cells that make up like the reproductive parts, and then there's a group of cells that make up the tentacles. It's a weird, I mean, we're all animals, all critter, all organisms are groups of cells. I get that, but what I'm trying to say is each of those cells is kind of independent. It's not really living together as an individual organism. It's more like several different organismal groups living together. And it's sort of a technicality, but it is sort of a bizarre critter that way. If you ever wonder, moon jellyfish are very common here in Florida. I've seen them in the Indian River. And if you ever wondered what those four little rings were inside, those are the reproductive organs. Those are the gonads of that organism. So now you know the naughty bits of a jellyfish next time you see it. Hi, Sean. How are you today? The swimmers, well, there's a variety of ways they can do it. They can maintain their buoyancy. Hold on a second. The guy with the weed whacker. Doing well, thanks. One of the ways that the swimmers can maintain their buoyancy is by having gas containers like this is a chambered nautilus. They're related to squid, octopus. It's got tentacles. There's the critter. There's the eye. And it lives inside. This is the inside of a chambered nautilus right here. And what they can actually do is they can actually use these chambers to add or take water out of them to increase or decrease buoyancy, like a submarine does. A squid has something similar. Remember, these organisms I said are related to squid. A squid has a ram horn inside of it. Look, see, it looks very similar. Same idea. You can pump water in and out of it to increase and decrease buoyancy. And fish have swim bladders. I talked to you about swim bladders in a previous chapter, but it's a unique organ that they can inflate and deflate with air, gas, which causes them to float. The one on the left is the swim bladder that I explained to you. There's another type of swim bladder in which the connection or where the air comes from into the swim bladder comes from the esophagus. See, in this one, it's got a little pneumatic duct. Now, what's interesting about this one is the idea that, you know, somewhere along the way, you could imagine an organism, you know, that turning into the pneumatic duct turning into a trachea, and these kind of turning into lungs. And that's kind of what happened there, more or less. Right. So even in evolution, when we look at the advancement of organisms, we see evidences of it already beginning, way in the past. That's what I always think is kind of cool, kind of like detective work. Cephalopods can use a siphon for swimming. They get pretty good air out of it too. This is a cephalopod coming up out of the air, a squid. They actually trap water in their mantle cavity and then they squirt it out through this siphon. So they provide a little bit of thrust and probably to escape predators, if you think about it. If there was some predator down here getting ready to feed on this guy, there's supposed to be a mouth with teeth there. You could jump out of the water. Flying fish do it too. We have flying fish in Florida. They can do the same thing. Flying fish are really cool. When you look at the tail fin of a flying fish, it's longer on the bottom than it is on the top. So a flying fish tail fin is like that, and then it's shorter on top. And the reason being is because when they're flying above the water, as they start to lose altitude, because they're basically, gliding, right? As they lose altitude, they can get a few, a little bit distance further, because as they descend down, they can stick that bottom part of the tail into the water and swoosh it back and forth and get a little more thrust. They don't have to be, eventually they fall into the water, but at least that gives them buys them a little time. Okay, as far as the fins go in terms of swimming, the ones that are vertical, the ones that are vertical are usually involved in stability. So you'll have dorsal fins, you'll have anal fins. The pelvic fins and the pectoral fins are typically used for steering. The caudal fin is used for thrust, okay, moving the animal forward. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, among wrasses, and this is actually a characteristic of many wrasses. We have wrasses here in Florida, so if you go snorkeling or scuba diving, look for a fish, and they swim by basically, they hardly really move their tail fin at all. They swim by moving their pectoral fins. That's how they swim. Like if you were paddling on a surfboard or swimming without using your feet, just kind of kicking you're moving your hands back and forth. That's how they swim. So there are exceptions to all that. And if you ever wondered why, when you looked at your salmon steak or your tuna steak, why you saw these little Z's back and forth, those are called myomeres. It's on here somewhere. There we go. Myomeres. The reason, and that's muscle tissue, and the reason why it's shaped like that in myomeres is because of the way a fish swims, right? See, a fish swim by moving their muscles in this wave motion. So these myomeres are designed through evolution to be most efficient at transmitting that wave motion force of transmitting as much as you can to the tail. It's kind of like building, kind of like a dog shaking water off its tail, off its body, how it shakes from the front to the back. In this case, the muscle contraction is moving from the front to back, and it's increasing in force as it moves back, and then it hits the tail. I can tell you I got firsthand knowledge of that. I was on a fishing boat when I was back in grad school, and they had brought a hammerhead shark up on the deck, and it'd been out there for a while. And we figured for sure it was dead, or I figured for sure it was dead. So I was down there, and I was getting ready to whip it over the side. It had come up, kind of beat up anyway, so it was probably an animal was going to die anyway. So I was going to whip it over the side, and grabbed its tail, and it whipped its tail and whipped me across the deck. Now, I'm not a big guy, but man, I could definitely feel the force. It was kind of, man, it just ripped me, flung me all the way on the other side of the deck. So a lot of force in there. Temperature control. Okay, this is a little interesting because you may not know this before. We all know about warm-blooded and cold-blooded. We use that terms all the time. And we all know that warm-blooded critters are the mammals and the birds and that sort of stuff. And the cold-blooded critters are the snakes and the insects and kind of pretty much everybody else. But there's actually some subsets to that. So let's take a look. Look at this table on the left. This isn't in your book. But the old cold-blooded and warm-blooded is sometimes referred to as homeotherms and poikilotherms. And I've also seen it used as being ectothermic or endothermic. But it's actually, they both together they mean they mean something slightly different, okay? So let's look at the homeotherms first. A homeotherm is like you and I. We can regulate our body temperature, all right? Now, the only homeotherms that exist are those that are endotherms. Now, what that means by endotherm is the body temperature that we have, okay, the warmth that we have is what we call metabolic heat. All right, so it's heat that we get from the chemical reactions that go on in our body, the digestion of food, all of that stuff. Every time you transfer energy, you're going to have a heat, a bit of heat that's generated. A lot of your food that you consume actually is used to keep your body warm. Now, we'll look at on the right in just a second. There are some advantages and disadvantages, and you'll see why. Why is this wasted energy? Why is this energy being wasted at heat? There actually is a good reason for it. So that's the mammals and the birds. Now, the one in the upper left, the poikilotherms and the ectotherms, so the one up here, that's the reptiles, fish, and birds. And what we mean by poikilotherm is the temperature varies with the environment. So poikilotherm and ectotherm do kind of mean the same thing. All right, ectotherm, most of the metabolic heat is lost to the environment. The body temperature matches the external environment. It's why reptiles have to have warming rocks. If you ever had a pet iguana, or you see them on the sidewalks when the sun's out and they're warming up on the concrete of the sidewalk, they're getting their temperature from the environment. Now, here's where it's a little bit different. We're an endotherm, right? So we retain, as it says, significant metabolic heat. So our internal temperature stays warmer than the external. The difference between a homeotherm endotherm and a poikilotherm endotherm is in this part of the definition. Internal temperature stays warmer than the external environment. In the case of human beings, in Celsius, our body temperature our internal core body temperature stays at a constant 37 degrees Celsius, and it doesn't vary from that. Dogs or sheep are a little bit warmer. Sheep, it's 40 degrees Celsius, 98.6, okay? What this means here, and what can happen in these animals, these larger sharks, and this is, gosh, I was in grad school when the information from this was actually put together. What these animals are able to do is they're able to raise their body temperature up. Now, they can't keep it to a constant rate like we do at 37, or sheep like at 40. But if the ambient temperature outside is 18 degrees Celsius in the water, they can raise their body temp to stored metabolic heat to say 21 degrees Celsius, a few degrees warmer. And if you're thinking, well, what would that do? Well, if you remember maybe back from high school or chemistry classes or biology classes, you might remember that chemical reactions occur more quickly the warmer the environment. If you warm something up, the molecules are moving more quickly, and chemical reactions are no more than molecules getting together or being split apart. So the faster that's happening, or the warmer that is, the faster that's going to be happening. So what these large sharks do, these tuna and these billfish, swordfish, marlin, sailfish, those are billfish, what they're able to do is they're able to jack up their internal body temperature just a few degrees above ambient, though. See, that's the difference. If it's 18 degrees Celsius in the water and you jump in, your core, not your fingers, not your toes, I get it, but your core is going to stay 37 degrees Celsius, at least for a while till you're in there too long. They can't keep it at a temperature, but they can raise a little bit higher. So you see the difference between the two? So you see between a poikilotherm endotherm and a homeotherm endotherm? So we can keep constant here. The other one can just raise it. Okay, the advantages and the disadvantages on the right-hand side. Why be one way versus the other? There's got to be disadvantages and advantages to both, because there's two different kinds of critters out there. Hold on one second. And if it was a complete disadvantage to be one way, then through time those critters would have died out. So take a look at that chart I have on the right, endothermy and ectothermy. So now we're going to go back to the terminology where endothermy refers to all of those cold-blooded critters. And don't worry about those poikilothermic, endotherm, large sharks right now for this particular part. If you're an endotherm, the advantage is that you can survive in a wide range of conditions, right? If you have your own body temperature, you can live in the tropics, you can live in Antarctica, you live in the winter, you can survive at different times of the year. That's us, right? The disadvantage, though, is there's a cost associated with that. Because you're taking some of the energy out of the food and using it to keep yourself warm, reptiles aren't, right? To keep yourself warm, you're actually losing some of the energy you could use for growth or reproduction or body repair or something like that. It's like the advantage is you can be active in a whole bunch of conditions, but the disadvantage is it costs you more. It costs you more. You have to eat more. That's why endotherms, organisms like you and I, we eat on a pretty regular basis, right? Every day, more or less. Reptiles consume, or snakes can consume reptiles. Snakes can consume rats every 3 weeks, once a month. See, if you're an ectotherm, the advantage is you don't need a constant supply of food. You can eat now and then eat in a couple of weeks or so. Disadvantage, when it gets cold outside, you slow down. When it gets cold outside, you slow down, and that's not only just your chemical reactions, you slow down in your reactions, your ability to catch prey or get away from a predator. So you see there's the trade-offs. I remember a paper I heard about at a conference where a guy was studying these lizards that would hunt these insects that were in this really deep, bushy area that was shaded. He would notice the insects would go into the bush for a while and come out and go in and come out. He was thinking, why don't you just go in? There's plenty of prey and just keep eating. So what he found out is when they went inside, because it was shady, they started to cool off. So they'd run around really fast trying to catch as much as they could, but as they're going, they're slowing down. So they would crawl out of the bush into the sunlit area, warm up, get all charged up, and then kind of like a battery. Isn't that neat? I always think about that when you think about, or you notice organisms on Earth, folks, or just in general. If there's more than one way of doing something, think about what are the differences? Why is there more than one way? Because if there's really only one way to be truly efficient at something, so these organisms, there's many ways to be efficient. These organisms have figured out other ways to do it. Oh, I like this. This is cool. The caudal fins. You can tell a lot about a fish in terms of its habits based on its body form and structure. And one of the things that you look at oftentimes are caudal fins, the tail fins, right? If it's rounded, they're flexible. These are the slow speed guys. This is a blue angelfish, gray angelfish. That's a goatfish. All goatfish, here's a little tidbit for you. All goatfish have these little barbs that hang down below. That's why they're called goatfish. They use them for this. Like if they feed on things that are buried in the sand, so they swim along the bottom, and then they let the little barbs from their chin kind of, they have taste receptors on the end of those little barbs that hang down. They can put them down. I've seen them many times. They'll go along and they'll kind of push them into the dirt, and they can taste if there's something down there to eat. Kind of bizarre, right? Rounded fins are good for maneuverability. These are reef organisms that live around a coral reef, where maneuverability would be, would be a premium. You'd want to be able to do that. The swordfish over here, and they have what we call a truncate forked fin. Sharks have that. They're faster. Propulsion, maneuverability, that's what you're looking for. These are the fast predators, the predators that are moving after things very quickly. Now, lunate fins, which are more rounded like. So this one would be more lunate. This would be more truncate or forked. Lunate fins are similar. They give you a lot of maneuverability, a lot of speed. It's really kind of interesting if you look at the size of that fish, where it's very, it's a large body fish with a small tail. The thing about it is we're showing you the myomeres, the muscles. There's a really narrow connection at the back, and the narrower the connection and the thinner that caudal fin, typically the faster the fish is. So there's a very interesting hydrodynamic physical process that occurs. All that muscle strength from those myomeres is being delivered to that one little focus point, like you would take a hand lens with light to that one focus point. It's whipping that fin back and forth. And since it's not really big, it doesn't have a lot of drag. Now it doesn't have a lot of surface area to push, but it's kind of the same thing with horses. Horses have long, thin legs with big, high muscles up high, so they can whip those legs really fast when they're running. Sharks have an interesting thing called a heterocercal. Heterocercal means, like in the fin, it's kind of the opposite what I showed you on the flying fish. The top lobe is generally bigger than the bottom lobe. See this guy? top lobe is longer. It's not always the case. It's an asymmetrical lobe, and it's physics, folks. Sharks don't have a swim bladder. Okay, so they don't have a swim bladder, so they have buoyancy issues. One of the ways they remain buoyant is their skin's they have a very big, oily liver. Gosh, that liver I cut out at manta ray was the manta ray was 13 feet across. The liver weighed about 300 pounds. But another way that they are able to increase buoyancy is by providing lift through that heterocercal caudal fin. You see, a typical forked or lunate fin would just delivers force in that direction forward. But here, a heterocercal caudal fin is actually able to deliver some of the force in the upward direction. So what it does is it takes the body of the shark and it pushes it down. Then as the body of the shark is pushed down, the fins right here become like wings of an airplane, and so it uses the wings as the fins as lift, as wings. So the heterocercal caudal fin pushes the shark down, so it increases the force down as it's going forward, so that the fins become more effective at lifting the animal up. The front nose area right here is good for buoyancy in a shark too, because it's built to kind of allow the animal to ride up, you know? Master predators. Speaking of predators, okay, if you're a predator, it's all about the muscle mass that you got and the type of muscle. A predator, there are two types of muscle out there. There's red and white, and there's a big chunk of tuna that'll show you what I'm talking about. The white is never really white. It's just kind of whiter than the red, if you will. The red is very high in the stuff called myoglobin, which is very much like hemoglobin. It carries oxygen. It's the pigmented molecule that delivers oxygen. So you supply more oxygen, you can have a much higher metabolic rate and higher endurance rate. So these high concentrations of myoglobin can do that. Sometimes runners that are going to run a marathon will go train at high altitudes for a while, because when you are at high altitudes where there's less oxygen, your body will respond by making more red blood cells. And so when you come back down to the lower altitude to run the race, you have more red blood cells, more endurance, okay? The white muscle mass fatigues more rapidly, but it's good for speed, short bursts of speed. So you can use the white muscle mass for those short bursts of speed. You can use the red muscle mass for the more sustained swimming. You can be fast, or you can be, I guess I was going to say sneaky, or you can hide yourself like these lungers. Lungers like the tiger group, or they're lie in wait. They just basically lay around. They don't have a lot of red muscle because they're not really doing a lot of long distance swimming. They're going to go for stealth and speed. Having that big mouth also helps too, doesn't it? I'll bet. So some poor little fish comes swimming along. And here comes the lunger. Yellowfin tuna, 46 miles an hour. Look at that fin. That is a beautiful lunate shaped caudal fin. Look at, I was talking about that area right in front of the fin, that thin little area. I was telling you, the more lunate and the thinner that area is called the peduncle. That's the peduncle. A different color. There we go. That's the peduncle right there. All these finlets along the way, the tuna, those are all stability too. These are fast movers, man. 46 miles an hour, that's hauling. These guys are going to be high in white muscle, right? But remember, the thing is, you can go fast for a short period of time. Schooling that we talked about at the very beginning, yeah, confusing the predator. The same reason white-tailed deer have white tails, right? A school of white-tailed deer, a predator comes upon them, they scatter. This tail is very has a lot of contrast against the background, and it's bouncing around as the deer are running away. So an animal that doesn't concentrate on one deer is easy to get confused and move back and forth, and before you know it, all the deer are gone, right? These are French grunts. This is a Florida species, French grunts, Hemilon flavolineatum. Grunts are called grunts because they make that sound. There's a variety of species of grunts, and if you are underwater and it's quiet enough, you're near enough of them, you can hear it. They're making a grunt sound. Very weird. Now, we've discussed symbiotic relationships before, right? This whole idea of predation and parasitism. I was looking at this today, and I'm like, I seem to remember discussing that in an earlier chapter. Did we talk about? Does anybody remember? We haven't? Okay. Maybe I'm just confusing this with my bio too. Symbiosis or a symbiotic relationship, the word literally means living things living together, okay? So what we mean by this is two organisms in some type of a relationship. It doesn't mean necessarily that both of them benefit, but they are engaged in a relationship. And so the first one makes sense, right? Predation. That is a relationship. Organism A is the eater. Organism B is the one that is eaten. That's a relationship. Nobody says the result is the best one, especially in this case of organism B. So, for example, that guy there chasing after that fish, he's the predator. He's going to gain the benefit. Fish is going to get the negative. Now, if you're a parasite, it's a little bit tricky. It's still a plus and a minus. But there's an old adage among parasitologists that a good parasite never kills its host. So what you mean by that with a parasite, you want to get as much out of the parasite as you can. And no doubt that's causing the parasite negative or the host negative effects, tapeworms and things like that. But you want to get as much out of that host as you can. You certainly don't want to kill it. You kind of want to keep it alive as long as you can so that you can remain alive. Commensalism is an interesting one. Commensalism is a relationship, and yet it's not. Commensalism is one organism gets a benefit and the other organism gains no benefit but suffers no loss or detriment either. Cattle egrets following cows here in Florida, right? You know, the cattle egrets that follow the cows. The cows kick up the insects, which the cattle egrets then feed upon. So the cow doesn't get anything from the bird. He doesn't care if the bird is there or not. It doesn't bother him that the bird's there. He gets no benefit from the bird. But the bird has a relationship with the cow, even if the cow doesn't know it. So it gets a benefit from it. Mutualism is the one we typically think about, right? You scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. Competition is an interesting one. Why is competition both negative? Why are there no winners when we're talking about organisms competing for something? Think about sharing. Think about competition as sharing. Why is it both organisms have a negative when it comes to sharing or competition? Well, that's a good thing though, right, Chantel? So that would be a good thing for the whole relationship together. But why for each critter is it both the negative in competition? I mean, we know why it's a negative in predation. You get eaten or parasitism, but why is it? What do you think, Amy? Or Sean? No? How about you, Amy, Sean, Daniela? What do y'all think? You've shared stuff before, right? Maybe with a younger brother or sister. So maybe a bag of potato chips. When you share something, do you get everything? No. When you compete for something, you don't get everything either. If two organisms are competing for a resource, we're not saying that one organism gets all of it and the other one doesn't, because the other one doesn't, it dies. But if they exist in a relationship, if the other one didn't go extinct, then that means one of them, I don't care if it's 90-10, 50-50 or whatever, neither organism gets everything. That's why we call competition a negative relationship. Yeah, there's a balance, right? And if you're all 100% on one side, that's not a balance. So yeah, absolutely. Competition is like sharing. You don't get everything to yourself. Okay, deep water swimmers. Deep water, out in the middle of the ocean swimmers. These are the organisms that eat detritus. Detritus is that rain of decomposing stuff that's falling through the water column, okay? The tridivores, and then, of course, there are the predators that eat those. No sunlight down here. No sunlight. I mean, it fades pretty quickly, so you're really dependent a lot on, organic light, if you will, light that comes from bioluminescence through things like photophores. So this fish down here, the one in the lower left, these little lit spots are photophores. They're little areas where bacteria live that glow. And in this particular species of fish, the photophores are actually indicative of the species. You can figure out what species it is and what sex. Since it's dark down there, the males and the females recognize each other by the way those lights light up. You know it's not only your species, but you know whether it's the opposite sex or not. As the light diminishes too, counter illumination is another way. It's a really good predation way, as well as a predator and predation. It's a good way to hide is what it is. This is what we mean by counter illumination. Look at this picture on the right. You have no idea what that is, right? You have no idea what that is, but that might be something, simple as like a squid. And as the light level drops, counter illumination is much better, right? Because the image becomes less and less distinct. All you're trying to do is break up the image so the organism doesn't know what it is. These guys are cool. These krill, they have bilobed eyes, okay? So inside their eye, there's a retina on the bottom, and there's a retina on the side. And then there's a lens on the side and a lens on the top. That's why the retina kind of actually goes across the whole thing. See with the yellow arrows, what I'm trying to indicate there? Why do you think it'd be good for them to have bilobed eyes, eyes that can see up and then forward? Do you have a good idea? That'd be kind of cool. You certainly wouldn't have to worry about birds pooping on you. Well, yeah, it would help with that, right? Because they can see up and forward, right? Now, there's no reason to see down because the water is only getting darker. But if you can see up, especially in those mid-water areas, the mid-lit areas, you can make out images above you, either prey or maybe predators, right? Very big eyes, right? Why would you have really big eyes where it's dark out? Well, you're going to have really big eyes because you need to gather in as much light as you can. It's like a telescope. Telescopes can see further off and more distinctly the bigger the mirror is because they're gathering more light. Big, large, sharp teeth, hinged jaws, expandable bodies. The reason why that is because you're living down there on the bottom. You're not really in control of what falls down above you. There's really no habitat for you to go to and find prey to eat. So guess what? You're basically a garbage gut. You eat everything. You eat everything. You have these hinged jaws so that you can accommodate pretty much any size chunk of food. You can't let one go by because not a whole lot goes by. And if you can get it through those big jaws, you're going to want that expandable stomach and body so that big chunk of food can stay in there. So you see what I mean? When you're down at the deep water like that, you really can't be choosy. You got to be able and adapted to eat everything. These are some examples of some deep water fish. These are anglerfish. And the reason why they're called anglerfish is they actually fish for other fish. They use this modified part of their dorsal fin. And at the end of it, they have this group of bioluminescent bacteria. So maybe it would look something like this. So what they do is they take that thing and they kind of jiggle it around, and other fish come up to investigate it, and boom, grabs them and eats them. Looks like something out of a horror movie, doesn't it? Now, being down in the deep water, reproduction is important, obviously, and you don't often come across a mate, and if you do, you may or may not see her or him. So among some species of fish, what happens is the male actually, when it's born, is a non-feeding organism. It has no way to eat, has no way to bring in food, so if it will die, right? But what it does is it needs to find a female. If it finds a female fast enough, it'll survive because it clamps onto the female and actually becomes part of her body, like grows into part of her body. And the nutrition that's provided for her, yeah, but then again, you're probably not, these fish aren't huge, so relatively speaking, those are probably pretty formidable looking choppers. But the male parasite becomes part of the female, and so nutritionally, that's where he gets all his food. And the only job he has, he spends his entire life attached to her, is every time she spawns eggs, he spawns sperm. That's his entire job. They always wondered, what this little thing was that was hanging off the fish, and that's what it was. It was one of those degenerate males. Degenerate in the sense that physically it's degenerated. Now, I guess the advantage of that is, you don't have to go out and get food, and all you have to do is basically ejaculate every once in a while, okay? But I guess the disadvantage is if this one gets eaten, right? If the host gets eaten, the host female, you do too. So I guess there is a disadvantage, like everything in life, huh? Okay, name some marine mammals. We're going to go to marine mammals next. Name me some marine mammals. Amy, name me a marine mammal. Okay. Chantel, give me a marine mammal. Ah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, yep. That's what I was going to. I was actually going to try to trick you guys. You're going to name, I would think, all the common ones. Give me a couple more. Got seals and polar bears. All right. Whales. Okay, there you go. Whales, dolphins, seals, sea lions, and oftentimes, Sean got it, is polar bears. A lot of times folks forget that polar bears are considered marine mammals. Now, they're not considered marine mammals in the biological sense, okay? They're considered marine mammals in the sense that of how they make a living. So the marine mammals in the biological sense tend to refer more to the whales and the porpoises and the dolphins and all that kind of stuff, okay? But the marine mammals in terms of the large ecosystem sense also includes the whales and the seals and the sea lions and the polar bears, okay? And even the sea otters are included in that group. Well, first of all, we had to figure out what a mammal is. Hopefully you know what one is. You are a mammal. Mammals are homeothermic endotherms. We just went through that. Air breathers, right? We don't, we got to survive. We can't breathe water. Fish are not air breathers. They get their oxygen out of water, but many of them can't breathe air. The distinguishing characteristic that all mammals have is that all mammals have hair. So even that spider out in the garage that scares the crap out of you, it looks like it's got hair. That's not really hair. Only mammals have hair. And most of us mammals give birth to live young, except for this guy over here. Who's that? What critter is that? It's a mammal and it lays eggs. One of the only ones that does. Yeah, manatees are considered marine mammals too, because sometimes they spend their time out in the ocean too. Who's that weird duck-billed looking critter on the right? And where do you find those? Country. Yeah, the land that time forgot. Strange critters. But they are indeed mammals, okay? So Order Carnivora, or the Order Carnivora, is the polar bears, the walruses, and the sea lions. Sirenia. Order Sirenia, named after the fact that early sailors and well, folks who went out to sea, when they would see manatees and dugongs, they think perhaps that's where the mermaid legend came from, right? That there are mermaids that exist. I don't know, man. I tell you, you have to be out to sea for quite a while before you think a manatee looks like a woman, I guess, but nonetheless. The cetaceans include two big groups, the toothed whales, okay, the odontocetes, and the mysticetes. The mysticetes, the mysta means mustached. We're talking about the baleen whales, the filter-feeding whales. So the toothed whales, the killer whale, the dolphins, and the porpoises, sperm whales you see there as well. And then the ones like the blue whales that feed upon the krill with the filter-feeding mechanisms. Let's take a look at the Order Carnivora first. The seals and the sea lions. Sea otters they float in these huge dents of kelp out in the eastern North Pacific. You just think what I used to see when I was in the Navy. It used to be so cool to kind of lay on your back, and they'll have an oyster or something, or a sea urchin, And they'll even have a rock sometimes that they use to bust open the oyster. And what they do is they just lay in these kelp beds and they kind of tangle themselves up in the kelp so they don't float away. And water's cold as hell, but the thing is, they have this really dense fur and this oil that's made that actually keeps them insulated. So they're nice and snug as a bug in a rug there, right? But because the fur was so nice, we liked them, and we almost hunted them to extinction. They don't have insulating blubber. See, like other marine mammals, to stay warm, like killer whales and things like that, have a thick layer of fat that keeps them warm. It's the fur on these guys that keep them warm. As I said, they can use rocks, and that's always cool. Organisms or animals using tools. It's always something that biologists get very excited about, animals using tools. Polar bears have these big webbed paws, good swimmers. They're waiting. What's that polar bear doing waiting by the hole in the ice? Anybody know? They have hollow hairs, too. Look at that. This is a picture I found online of the hair of a polar bear. It's good for insulation. Thick fur, very good for insulation. Yeah. Waiting for fish, or sometimes they'll also hunt belugas. You know, those white whales that come up for a breath in the ice holes. They'll grab one of those and try to drag it out on the ice and feed upon it. I wonder how long he'll stand there. But those hollow hairs are good for insulation, so they're able to keep themselves warm. And what they'll do oftentimes is they can, when they get in the water, you think, oh my God, how can they swim in that water? They actually trap a little bit of the water next to their skin, and then they're mammals. Then the warmth of their skin actually warms the water up. It's kind of like the way a wetsuit works for scuba divers. A wetsuit, a little bit of water gets into the wetsuit, and then your body warms up the water, and that's how you stay warm. And it's really cold outside. You can pee in your wetsuit too, so that it keeps you warm too. Done that a couple times. Pinnipeds are the walruses and the seals and the sea lions. It's not the tusks for male and female on the walruses, folks, because both males and females have tusks. Yeah, but they got really cold water. You need those out in California. I'm a wimp when it comes to cold water though too, so I could see myself using a dry suit, even in Florida water. Look at the paws on that polar bear, I tell you. Yeah, no kidding. Did you go scuba diving in Germany? In the Baltic? Or in the river, maybe? Or in the Med? Well, that wouldn't be Germany. That's dinner plate size, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, God. It gives me the chills just thinking about it. What was the water temperature? Like, you have to chop through the ice to get in there? I mean, I bet you that's beautiful, though. The water is so clear. Yeah, almost freezing. That's as big as your face, too, isn't it? Oh, yeah, I'm sure the water is incredibly clear. The visibility's got to be outrageous. When I worked at SeaWorld one time, I went backstage to the polar bear exhibit, and the folks who designed SeaWorld's polar bear backstage area were the same people who make prisons. Polar bears are nasty, nasty organisms. They're one of the few critters that have been documented to actually stalk human beings and try to consume them, try to eat them. So if you have a polar bear in a zoo, you don't take any chances. So the way this thing worked, and I'm not much of an artist, but imagine that this is the cage that the polar bear is in, and then there would be a door here, and then another door, and then a third door. Well, you could not. Okay, let's get this right. You could not open this door unless this door was closed. So if this door was open accidentally and the polar bears got out and got into this locality, if this door was open, you could not open this door. And then the same thing with the final door. And also the way the doors were open, up on the wall next to the door, they didn't use keys or anything like that. There was this box on the wall, and there were these two buttons. And the buttons were in sort of a depression. And what you had to do is put your two fingers into the buttons at the same time to get the gate or the door to open. The idea behind that is if you only put one button up on the wall, the polar bear can slap them with the big old paws like that and get the door open. And not to mention that the last way out too, they had a gun rack. Guess if I thought, well, that would have been the third place. The last minute, if you can't get it, gotta use the gun. Ain't nothing to mess around. 8, 10 feet tall when they stand up on their hind legs, big critters. Anybody know the difference between a seal and a sea lion? Did SeaWorld and heard at the show? What can sea lions do that seals can't? Fat. Blubber is fat. Like what the Eskimos chew on, muktuk, blubber. It's got a lot of energy in it, a lot of fat, or a lot of calories. Nobody knows the difference between a seal and a sea lion. You kidding me? You've never been to SeaWorld. Now do you know? Do you remember now? Oh, come on, you guys. Sea lion can bring their hind flippers up underneath them, right? So they can actually sit on their hind flippers. Seals cannot do that. That's the difference. I always remember that because sea lion, I think about lion has hind legs, right? So California sea lions, oh, loud critters. Bark, 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 bark incessantly at you. Seals are the true seals are earless, and doesn't mean they don't have ears. They don't have external ear flaps. That's good for hydrodynamic, right? You having things hanging off your body when you're trying to swim in the water, it actually slows you down. Sea lions spend a lot more time on land, and that's why they have the rear flippers the way they do, right? And seals basically, when they get out around on land, what they do is they kind of pull themselves on their flippers. But sea lions spend a little more time on land than seals do, so they have a greater mobility with the ability to fold their flippers up underneath. Mermaids, the manatees. Manatee is actually the most the closest common ancestor to a manatee. They have teeth very much like them too. Are elephants. Sometimes they're called sea elephants. Sometimes they've even heard called sea cows. That's wrong. They're herbivores. One of the characteristics that unites them with the elephants is the trunk of the elephant and the snout. Right, that's right. And the snout of the manatees. The manatee snout is it's flexible, right? It's called a proboscis. They use it and they gather up the herbivorous material with their mouth. So that's kind of that's a variation of the trunk on the elephants. That's one of the common characteristics they have. We have the manatees in the coastal areas of the Atlantic, very much subject to anthropogenic effects. Very much. In some cases, they are eaten. They aren't allowed to be eaten in this country. Of course, they're protected, but in other areas of the Caribbean, they are. On the other side of the world, we have a similar critter called a dugong. This is a dugong. Dugongs have more of a forked tail, and the manatees have more of that paddle. So dugongs are another Sirenian. This one is extinct since the 18th century, Steller sea cows. Remember I said they were good to eat, and these things were huge. So when the Europeans came over, like a lot of other things, what they did is they caused the extinction of the Steller sea cows by eating them all. The cetaceans, these are the whales, the dolphins, and the porpoises, okay? And these organisms are organisms that evolved out of critters that were living on land. We say that among cetaceans, among whales and dolphins and porpoises, that they secondarily went back to the water. And what we mean by that is we think life evolved in the water, crawled out onto land, and then some organisms actually moved back into the water. And you see in the middle of the slide there, I'm trying to show you, don't worry about the names of these, but these are fossilized remnants of organisms that we believe are along the path to these animals moving back into the water. And what I want to show you is in the red arrow that you see there. You notice what's happening as we go. So we're going through time this way, okay? And you notice what's happening in the skull. It's getting longer, right? And that's something we call telescoping. One of the significant characteristics that occurred in whales and dolphins and cetaceans for swimming is the elongating of this skull. And of course, what that does is increases the hydrodynamic, right? Or decreases the drag, actually, makes the animal more hydrodynamic. The other thing it does with the telescoping of the skull is the blowhole or the nostrils, right, move from the tip, basically, or from the front of the skull where it would be, back up to the top of the skull. So for an organism living in water, those two adaptations were significant, weren't they? Because you're increasing the ability of the animal to cut through the water efficiently, and you're moving its blowhole on top of its skull, so it doesn't have to lift its whole head out of water to breathe. It just has to clear the surface of the water and get its blowholes above the water. Few hairs, right? Few hairs. Sometimes when they're born, this killer whale down here, if you look in the picture carefully, you can see it's got rostral. Rostral means nose, basically. See them? Those are rostral hairs. They're only found on calves. They're lost as they get older. They fall off. I actually was able to get one. I have one in my office. It's cool. Looks like a little tiny whisker. But they're used to help them know if they're close to the mother. But hair is not something that's good in the water. Well, you think about all the swimmers like Michael Phelps and Ryan Lochte and all them folks, you know, they shave their bodies. Because when you shave your body, it's less drag in the water. So a lot of marine mammals, you know, the polar bear, but he's not someone who's cooking through the water very quick. If he's in the water, he's pretty much in the water moving from one ice floe to the other. Modify them legs or that tail to a fluke. All right, get rid of the hind legs, actually. I'm sorry. Front legs are going to become the pectoral flippers. But modify that tail part into a fluke. And you probably know this, but you can actually, biologists can actually use flukes to identify certain organisms, certain whales. It's like a fingerprint. It's very cool. There are entire books, entire computer programs, and they'll go out and they'll photograph these whales, and they come back and the computer will match them up, and they'll say, oh, that's so-and-so. And then you can, and you can track who was born. I mean, you can get their entire family history. You know how long so-and-so's been born, and they have some of these photos that go back 20, 25 years. So you know how long so-and-so's been born. You know who he was born to. You know who she was born to. You know who offspring she had. That's really cool. Right here, if you can see the picture is a little bit small, but actually these are record numbers of these. These are the animals. They might have actually names for them too, but these are their actual catalog numbers, if you will. All right, so you get the big whales, the blue whale, largest whale on the planet. Gray whales who basically are, what's he doing on the bottom? He scrapes along the bottom. He's able to pick up some food, some benthic organisms. One thing you might not know is that the killer whale is truly not a whale. It actually is a dolphin, by technical terms. Look at the comparison. Oh, man, can you imagine how cool that would be to dive with animals like this, though? That would be awesome. Anybody know why right whales are called right whales? This is a right whale, R-I-G-H-T. This is the baleen. This is a filter feeder. These are also baleen whales too. Anybody know why that's called the right whale? Why not a left whale? It was the right whale to hunt. When whales were harpooned, many times they would dive, right whales would float. They would surface. So when the whalers were out hunting whales, the right whales were the right whale to hunt because they were easier. When you harpoon them, they would float, and they could process them. This is something new. Came out 20 years ago or so. So relatively new. The relationship of cetaceans, the relationship of whales and dolphins and porpoises to other mammals. It was kind of unsure, but we figured out that it looks like, if you look down below, that some of the closest relatives to cetaceans are the hippopotamus group of organisms. Now, the hippopotamus and this other group over here called even-toed ungulates includes, among other organisms, cows. So that's the basis of this picture up here. And the question basically asks you, are cetaceans artiodactyls? What in the heck is an artiodactyl? An even-toed ungulate is an artiodactyl. So we find out that maybe some of the most closest, relatively speaking, some of the most closest relatives of the dolphins and the porpoises is your old buddy, the cow. So that's kind of cool because now we know it was out of that group. It was some sort of an artiodactyl critter, some sort of an even-toed ungulate. Ungulate are grazers, basically. Even-toed ungulate that secondly went back into the water. Now, speaking of the water are things that you have to deal with, especially if you're a deep diver. Sperm whales can descend down to incredible 9,000 feet. Here's one at over 1,900 feet in that picture. Isn't that amazing? And in order to survive that, there's a couple of things that they do. One of the things is they're going to reduce their heart rate, right? They can reduce their heart rate 20 to 50%. They can lower their respiratory rate, significantly lower than in humans. They have a very high density of red blood cells, the things that carry the oxygen. Overall, what basically they're able to do with this lower respiratory rate and lower reduction in heart rate is they decrease demand. Okay, so they decrease demand for oxygen. And they're also extremely efficient at absorbing the oxygen out of the air that they have inhaled. They have little tiny pockets in their lungs that get smaller and smaller, even much more so than in our lungs. We only extract about 6%. They get almost all of it, almost 90%. They can also shunt blood too. So what they do is when they're diving deep, what they'll do is because oxygen levels are dropping because they're holding their breath, remember they're air breathers, they'll move blood. They can actually turn off blood being delivered or reduce the blood being delivered to more non-critical things, stomachs, kidneys, and all that sort of stuff, and make sure that the heart and the brain, the lungs, the muscles, all the important things, they can increase the flow to that. So they can actually move the flow of their blood around. It's amazing. Their muscles have a much higher tolerance to carbon dioxide and anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is when you produce food without oxygen. We all do it, but there's a limit to how much you can do. They have a much higher tolerance of that. The reason why I put that carbon dioxide triggers breathing is that's what causes you to breathe, by the way. It's not the lack of oxygen, it's the accumulation of carbon dioxide. Your body triggers on that. Accumulation of carbon dioxide in your blood makes your blood a little more acidic. Your body cues on. That's why you can't hold your breath and die. Your body will make you breathe. Anybody who's divers knows that there's the problem with deep diving. Two big problems are nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness, or the bends. These organisms here, these deep diving organisms, they suffer from these too. They just have higher tolerance. Nitrogen narcosis, nitrogen in high concentrations causes narcosis, a drunkenness feeling caused by deep diving. About 100 feet in humans, we can start feeling it. The pressure of the water pushing around you increases the absorption of nitrogen. That's what causes that. And the nitrogen getting into your system later on when you resurface then causes the bends. Because nitrogen is the gas, and of course, that nitrogen is in the air of the scuba tank you're taking. Folks who do a lot of deep diving, right, what they do is they have special scuba tanks of air in which most, if not all, of the nitrogen take. Remember, most of our atmospheric air is nitrogen. So when you fill up a regular scuba tank, it has the same concentration. It's that nitrogen that's the problem. It's not a problem unless you're at depth, though. See, when you come out of the depth, the decompression sickness, the bends, is because nitrogen begins to bubble out of your bloodstream if you resurface too quickly. I always remember the old adage in scuba diving is never surface any faster than your bubbles that you're exhaling. The bends can kill you. Can definitely kill you. It can cause bone damage, pain, and it can eventually cause death. They treat these people by putting them into hyperbaric structures. And they have them at like Miami's got one, and they pressurize you again and then bring you back up more slowly. That's why it's so important that divers understand the idea of descending slowly so that you don't get, especially when you're going from depth. Now, as I said, the cetaceans aren't immune to any of this. They're just basically more tolerant. The rib cage collapses basically at anything deeper than about 70 meters. And what that does is that removes any remaining air. Okay, that's not a good thing necessarily, right? Because less oxygen, but it does minimize nitrogen absorption. Life's all about trade-offs. So you get one good with a problem. They also have just an overall higher tolerance to nitrogen too. slide is messed up, folks. Those need to be swapped, and that needs to be swapped. I'm sorry. I didn't notice that till today. The toothed whales, the odontocetes, odont means teeth, obviously, the dolphins and the porpoises, the killer whales, like I mentioned, belong in this group too. Sperm whales, they're named because obviously they're the toothed whales. They're not the filter feeders. And if you ever wondered the difference between a dolphin and a porpoise, it's really more just kind of body shape. Dolphins are more streamlined, and porpoises overall are just stouter, blunter. Falcate, what is falcate? This is falcate. Kind of a triangular little hump versus a hook. Right, the dorsal fin is more triangular in a dolphin than it is in a porpoise. Killer whale dolphin dorsal fins are extremely triangular, males more so than females. It's actually a sexual selecting characteristic. Females select males with very tall dorsal fins. And what happens sometimes is Mother Nature kind of goes crazy with that idea. If evolution supports, or if evolution favors, if organisms favor males with really tall dorsal fins, that will continue to increase. The dorsal fins will continue to increase in height, and sometimes engineering takes over. Sometimes what happens is the cartilage, because that fin is only held up by cartilage, can't handle the strain, and the fin flops over. This is Tilly at SeaWorld. His flopped over dorsal fin has nothing to do with his mood or how he feels. It simply has to do with the fact that he has a very tall dorsal. There are reports of killer whales, males in the wild, and even some females with abnormally tall dorsal fins that are all flopped over. So it's not a mood thing. And it's not an artifact of captivity either. Oh, this is cool. Echolocation. Only the toothed whales can do this. As you can imagine in the ocean, your ability to see is pretty limited, right? Sediment, plankton, light being filtered out. So that's going to limit the vision of you as well as marine mammals. But what the large whales can do is they use this thing called a monkey's muzzle. This is a monkey's muzzle. Looks like a monkey's muzzle, doesn't it? If you ever played trumpet, and I never did, but you know that the way you make the sound through the mouthpiece. Oh, Amy, you played the what is that thing you played? I'm sorry. Amy still here? Yeah, and it has a what's the thing that you put in a trumpet, the little piece, the mouthpiece, right? There's a mouthpiece, and when you don't blow into it, right? You purse your lips, and I don't even know the word I'm trying to find, but I bet you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, thank you. That's what they do with the monkey muzzle. It's that buzzing. They buzz that through that monkey muzzle, and they snap it closed, and it causes this sound to be created. Now, check out the whole front of their head is this echo device, because here's what happens. Here's the monkey's muzzle up front, right? It's near the blowhole. The monkey muzzle makes that buzzing noise, and it has this loud snap that occurs. It makes a click. And what it does is it bounces the sound off the skull. If you were to see the skull of some of these animals with all the meat taken away, it's actually kind of a dish. So the sound bounces off that skull and out through the front of the animal, and then they receive the signal back through their lower jaw, which then is transmitted to their ear. So they're actually able to create these sounds with that buzzing and that clicking of the monkey's muzzle, and that goes out like radar, echolocation, into the water and bounces back, and then using their lower jaw. Now, dolphins have a similar thing. They don't have a monkey's muzzle. They have something called phonic lips. When you hear the paw, love paw, or whatever those things, that's what they're using. They're using their phonic lips. But they can create these sounds. And a spermaceti and a melon, these are organs full of oil, and what they do is they can focus that sound. Dolphin echolocation, cetacean echolocation in general, is so good that they can oftentimes not only tell distance, but they can tell size. They can many times tell texture. They've done experiments where dolphins can tell the difference between a ball and another ball of the same size, but covered in a fuzzy fabric. They can actually sense the texture with their echolocation. So it's a pretty incredible sense. Bats have it too, right? Similar idea. I think that'd be kind of neat to have that. Okay, the mysticetes. Now the mysticetes, the mustache. And what we mean by the mustache is the baleen. This is the baleen. Baleen is made of keratin. It's a substance called keratin. Your nails are made of keratin. I'm trying to find my mouse again. There we are. Okay. And what this stuff does is it hangs down from the mouth, just like you see in the picture. Got a picture for you so you can get sort of a frame of reference. And these animals have these big extendable throat regions where they can basically open their mouth. See down here in what I'm talking about? They open their mouth, the krill swim in. They then close their mouth and raise their tongue. When they close their mouth and they raise their tongue, that's where the baleen comes into play. It acts like a sieve. It acts like a colander, because what gets squeezed out through the baleen is the water, and all the krill remain inside. So they can swim through these huge schools of krill, right? And just scooping these things up, squeezing out the water, filtering out the krill. How neat. I have some baleen. Remind me in class next week. I'll show you some. These are the guys that do those really cool low frequency vocalizations that can go like over 30 miles. The whale sounds that you've heard. Could be a female thing, could be a territorial thing, could be a combination of both. This is a cool behavior. Humpback whales do this thing, this cooperative feeding thing called creating a bubble net. What they basically do is they come up from depth, swimming in a circle, all of them swimming around each other, and they're exhaling. And as they do, they're exhaling this ring of bubbles. And in that ring of bubbles, fish get captured. And then they come up through the middle of the ring and scoop up all the fish. It's like when you eat pistachios, how you like peel like 8 or 9 of them and just eat them all at once. And then sometimes you just break them and eat them. Okay, I got 1 minute. Let's finish this up. Whales as endangered species. In 1948, the International Whaling Commission was formed to manage whale hunting. 72 nations have signed the ban and have agreed to it in 86. There is legal hunting allowed. You can see over the right, or not in the right, the species of whales, but not every country has signed this. There are objections. For example, countries don't have to sign the ban if they object to the ban. They can do scientific whaling. That's what Japan does with the minke whales. And like the bowhead whales, that the aboriginals, that the Eskimos that live up there, they feed on bowhead whales, but they take one bowhead whale for the village for the year. And in 1972 or 1973, 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act was enacted, protects all marine mammals. The Endangered Species Act was in 73, which is more than just marine mammals, but also includes those endangered marine mammals. Whales and dolphins and porpoise, about a quarter of those are threatened, and I listed some of the major threats down below. Entanglement in fishing gear, especially ghost nets that are left. Directed harvesting. Again, the Japanese go down and fish for minke whales off Antarctica. They call it scientific whaling, but when they're done with all the samples they've collected, they sell it. Noise pollution, especially from military, seismic sonar can affect their hearing, getting hit by a boat, pollution. Number one cause, folks, always. Habitat loss, loss of prey, hunting, climate change. All of the changes that occur because of climate change, the changes in the water temperature, like we talked about the other day, the changes in the circulation patterns and all of that stuff, that's all affected by that together. You can see some species of whales are actually doing all right. And some, like the right whales, remember I said the right whales, they really took a pounding. All right, folks, let me finish the recording there. I went over a little bit, I apologize, but that finishes that chapter.